everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
Oh, boy, everybody. So I know we've been in a tough year. There have been a lot of tough conversations, and I thought we should have another one. What do you say?
There's always
I'm here for it.
There's always room for more tough conversations.
Good. All right. Well, I'm glad we're having a tough conversation because, usually when we talk about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research on this podcast, we cover a lot of topics, some of them more challenging than others. But I think we all agree that behavior analysis is the best and really should be doing everything it can as a field to support the growth of our society. And one of the issues that's kind of a hot button issue, it has been for a while, it certainly should continue to be, is the issue of police brutality and what types of behaviors are maintaining or what types of reinforcers and punishers might be maintaining police brutality, specifically in speaking to racial inequity in our country. And as far as we knew, that was not a topic that has a ton of research, but we were very fortunate to have one of kind of the early researchers on this topic looking at police brutality, and not just police brutality, but how it might relate to our most kind of needy clients or most vulnerable clients with staff mistreatment or staff mistreatment of clients. And luckily we have on the line a very special guest who has been doing some deep thinking, deep writing about this topic. And that is Dr. Cody Morris. Cody, thank you so much for coming on the show to have a tough conversation with us.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Well, we are very excited that you are one of the people who, when there was a recent call from Behavior Analysis and Practice to do a special issue on racial inequality in the country and issues related to racial inequality, you were one of the people who stood up and said, I've got some ideas, I've got some things to share, I've got some things that I think can keep the conversation going in the right direction for our field. And huzzah, you published an article in that special issue, and that is the article that we are going to be spending our evening talking about. So, Cody, you're totally ready to do all the heavy lifting, right?
I'll do what I can.
Oh, good. It's always nice to have a guest on and say, hey, it's a hard topic. Here you go.
And he worked out beforehand. He's ready.
Rob's also expecting his host gift as well in the mail.
So, Cody, you wrote on, and I'll tell all the listeners out there, you wrote in the special issue in BAP on racial inequity, and you wrote an article titled On the Uncanny Similarities Between Police Brutality and Client Mistreatment by yourself and by Nicole Hollins. And again, that was in the special BAP issue in 2020. So nice when we can come back to 2020.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
And I've got to get it was.
Oh, so go ahead, Cody.
I was just going to say, I want to give a quick shout out to my co-author, Nicole Hollins, who came up with the title of the paper. I've done a few projects with Nicole now, and she is a master at coming up with titles. I really like this title of our paper. All credit to Nicole.
Nice.
All right.
I love the title. I love the word uncanny, and I think it never gets used enough.
Yeah.
And when I read this, I was like, oh, it's very Alice in Wonderland-esque in the first part, but then not at all in the second part.
Yeah,
so I was like, I'm reading this before you told me to.
So I know we've had a number of guests on, and we've been really trying to make sure that as a show we delve into areas of research that I think a lot of people in the field of behavior analysis are just so excited to be able to look at and share, because there just isn't a lot of research from our field on the issue of racial inequality and issues related to it. So certainly looking at, the criminal justice system, looking at police brutality specifically. And also then the great thing about your paper is that it also then delves into the idea of how so many of the variables that might maintain police brutality could really be brought home to the areas where we do have a lot of research in behavior analysis, specifically in the appropriate and ethical treatment of individuals with disabilities. So I guess before we get into all of that, though, we should probably step back. We'll give you the easy question first. And that's going to be, Cody, please tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, maybe that's a hard question, but I hope that's the easiest, the easiest one.
I think it's difficult and easy at the same time. Whenever I'm asked that, I always sort of struggle with how far back to go. But for the purposes of this podcast, I'll start by saying that I'm a Western Michigan University graduate. I did all of my degrees there. Dr. Stephanie Peterson hooked me into behavior analysis when I was young and impressionable as an undergrad. And I stuck with her through my master's and PhD and learned so much while I was there under her tutelage. And I actually met my co-author, Nicole Hollins, while at Western Michigan. She was also a Stephanie student. After graduating from Western Michigan, moved to Rhode Island to work at Salve Regina University to direct their graduate program in behavior analysis, where I just completed my second year. And throughout my PhD and my time here at Salve, I've had sort of, I suppose, a wide ranging interest in all things related to improving the practice of behavior analysis. And so I do some research on maybe more technical topics like data collection integrity and adapting assessment and treatment procedures for challenging behavior to fit more idiosyncratic variables and to be a bit more ecologically valid. I do some work on understanding the historical influences on practice and behavior analysis. I'm a bit of a history geek, so I enjoy doing research on that. I do some stuff on dissemination. So, you guys are sort of the masters of the dissemination of information.
Oh, stop, Cody. No.
No, seriously. So I produce and host a behavior analysis and practice podcast. And when researching that, I listened to a lot of your show and some of the other leading shows in behavior analysis in terms of podcasts. And it was a lot of help. So I try to contribute there where I can. And then I have sort of a line of research and I suppose service focused on client advocacy. So I've done some research and some work on assent and how you can really obtain assent from clients who aren't able to communicate through traditional assent procedures like written assent or verbal assent, right? And some of the nuances that fall into that. And then, of course, getting into this particular topic that we're going to be talking about tonight, which is ultimately around preventing mistreatment. And so that's a little bit about me. Can't think of anything else that you may want to know.
So tell us about your favorite vacation spot. No, I'm kidding. It was a fabulous introduction. I feel like I actually now have a very good grasp of you as an individual. So very cool. Very good.
Mission accomplished. I did it.
Anyway, thanks, Cody, for being on the show.
Even though we're rivals in university status.
Oh,
that's right. That's right. Remember what I said about careful granting me the ability to answer a question for an hour?
Well, let's get on to the topic that I know everyone's tuning in for too. So we'll make sure that we get a nice balance there. But the place I know I'd like to start. Actually, you know what? Even before I'd like to start, just in talking about an issue that is for some listeners, and I think for us too, is going to be covering a lot of what at least we would consider sensitive ground based on the ability of us as all white individuals to be speaking about an issue that we're sort of coming from a place of privilege in being able to speak about sort of from afar, because it may not impact us. It definitely does not impact us the same way it impacts a lot of other Americans, especially Americans of color. Diana, I know, had put together kind of a nice disclaimer that she wanted to bring up that kind of captured, I think, a lot of the thoughts. But I'd love if you do that, because you really, I think, put a lot of thought into the best way to phrase that. I learned a lot from you.
Oh, yeah. Well, this conversation is going to cover sort of two areas, right? And Cody will speak to this better, but we're going to be drawing similarities between the potential for police brutality. There I go again, just like in the preview. I can't say that phrase. Potential for police brutality and the potential for client mistreatment within the systems that are in place in each of those two settings. And I think what we want to recognize is that there will be discussion related to some vulnerable groups who have been, previously oppressed or profiled by each of those potential situations. And I think we need to all state that we're not members of either of those groups, right? So we're all white and we're all non-disabled folks. So we're not here to speak for them, right, in their position, because we can't understand what that position is. So we're not here to do that. But I think that there is still a responsibility that we have on our part, in that this is a conversation that needs to be happening in all corners and in all circles. So if we were to look at the groups that hold power within each of those organization. So folks who are in the police world and folks who are not specifically in the BCBA world, but just more broadly in behavioral services.
And the supervision role of behavioral services.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yes, thank you. Then both of those groups, depending on where you live, but in a lot of places are predominantly white groups. So this is a problem that needs to be looked at as the responsibility of everyone, right? And of white folks to look at the systems that are currently in place and think about how they can be restructured and better utilized. So it shouldn't only be the responsibility of the people who are in the position of being potentially victimized by those groups to bring up the concerns, right? So I think in that sense, it's appropriate for us to be coming to this conversation as long as we're recognizing the privilege that we have in coming to the conversation.
All right.
That's what I want to say.
Thank you, Dinah. I always appreciate hearing you put a lot of thought into this area, and I always appreciate hearing your disclaimers like that, because I think it is certainly something that is very new to me. If you've heard any other episodes where we've discussed this, very new to me to actually
that's what we all
checking my privilege.
Do,
so
right?
thank you for always reminding me of
is recognize our own position in the conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if anyone would like to come up to me and tell me to check my privilege, please do so, because that's feedback I really appreciate getting, because I definitely need it. So, all right. Cody, I would love it if you wouldn't mind starting off by sharing unfortunately, the tragic incident that is described at the beginning of your paper with Cornelius Fredericks. If you wouldn't mind starting that way, because I think it is a tragic event, but I think it captures the importance of discussing this topic. Is so well written of in your paper. So would you mind starting there for us?
Of course. So on April 29th, 2020, authorities responded to an alleged incident involving a 16-year-old African-American boy named Cornelius Fredericks. Reports stated that Cornelius had thrown part of a sandwich at someone with whom he shared a residence. In response to that alleged incident, authorities confronted Cornelius, which apparently provoked further food throwing from the teenager. When Cornelius began throwing food a second time, one of the authorities pushed him with two hands, which caused the teenager to fall onto the ground. And at that time, at least 3 responders proceeded to use what was later deemed to be significantly disproportionate restraining techniques on Cornelius. While at least 3 adults were restraining the teenager, he repeatedly cried out, "I can't breathe." Despite Cornelius's cries for help, the restraints continued for approximately 12 minutes until he became unresponsive. The authorities failed to provide CPR and delayed calling medical assistance for an additional 12 minutes. As a result, Cornelius suffered what coroners deemed restraint asphyxia, which led to a fatal heart attack 30 hours later. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past year, 2 years, 3 years, this story is going to sound very, very familiar to you. But what sets this story apart from individuals like George Floyd, Elijah McClain, and others is that Cornelius actually died at the hands of direct care staff in a licensed residential program. When I used the word authorities in that narrative, I was referring to trained youth counselors employed to protect and provide therapeutic services to Cornelius. They weren't police officers. And so when I learned about this story, I was heartbroken, absolutely devastated on so many different levels. And so I'm glad we started with this story, because this is actually where this paper started. The paper started when I read the story.
Mm-hmm. So Cody, it was a story that you heard, and then your kind of next thought was, what are the mechanisms here? This feels like an all too common occurrence in too many stratas of life, and I'm going to look into this, or sort of what was the genesis of that idea, that kind of kernel of that feeling of the tragedy into let's research what's out there.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've been interested in client mistreatment and police brutality, I suppose, informally. It's not something that I've, prior to this point, really spent much time formally researching. It's something that I've sort of read irrespective to ever thinking that I was going to contribute to this area in any way. It's just something that I've been interested in reading about for a few years now, really. And when I saw the call for papers through behavior analysis and practice related to racial bias and police brutality, I spent some time thinking about, do I have anything to add to that call for papers? And honestly, I couldn't think of anything. And I just kind of thought, it's a really important call for papers. And I thought about some of the research I had done, but it didn't really make sense for me at that time to contribute to that call for papers. And one day, so this is during the call for papers while it was open, I woke up in the morning and I do what I typically do in the morning, which is, I kind of read a little bit of news, and I saw an NPR story that drew my attention because it was about a child in Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is where I went to school for 10 years. That's where Western Michigan University is located. And I thought, wow, this is national news. This is interesting. And I click on that article, and it's the story of Cornelius. And hearing the story, seeing the sort of direct replication, if you will, of what happened to George Floyd, which was very salient at that time and still is, it broke my heart on that level. But it also upset me greatly knowing that I lived in Kalamazoo for 10 years. I provided a lot of services to the community in Kalamazoo. I never worked with Cornelius. I never worked in that treatment program that Cornelius ultimately died in. But I have worked with so many individuals that would sort of match that same client profile as Cornelius. And I worked in a lot of programs that were very similar to the program that he died in. And so it really struck me and really stuck with me. And I spent that entire day thinking about it and thinking about how this could come to be. Like, what are the systems that allowed something like this to happen? And without really thinking about it or knowing it, I was basically writing a paper, like in my head the entire day. Like I was sort of outlining and trying to process what happened and what could explain what we were reading and seeing. And that night, I'm not one to lose sleep. I'm a great sleeper. It's not an issue that I really ever have. That night, I had a really difficult time falling asleep. Like I kept thinking about Cornelius and the situation, and basically wrote the introduction in my head that night. Woke up the next morning, started putting the introduction on paper, and called my friend Nicole Hollins, who I went to grad school with, who does a lot of research specifically in school settings looking at racial bias. Asked if she'd like to collaborate with me on the paper. And we basically wrote this paper in 4 days. It was like, I was like a man possessed, basically. I couldn't stop writing this paper.
To be honest, though, I read it that way. I read it as like a call to action. And so, my question about how did you come up with these, like this parallel? It seems like it's not something that you would like think about. It'd be like like a revelation. That's why I wanted to know, like, I asked the question, like, where were you the moment that you drew those parallels? Because it seems that these are so vastly different, right?
Right.
But then when you're like, because you probably did that, I imagine. Everyone doing that, right? That they're not at all that different. Even though, functionally they may be different topographically, they have the same kind of power structure, right? And vulnerable population. So I'm glad that you could give me that satisfaction of knowing where you were and like how did this transpire? Because it felt, when I read it, it felt urgent. And I think it's important, right? Because it is urgent.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that what I was attempting to do when writing it, it's very sort of unorthodox, right? I start with a story about an individual. That's not what you're typically going to see when you pick up an academic journal. But I wanted people to experience what I experienced, which was reading the story of this horrendous tragedy, realizing that this happened in a treatment program that has a lot of similarities to behavior analytic treatment programs and realize no one is safe from these type of issues unless we go about systematically assessing them and intervening on these issues. Our clients may not be safe from the very things that are affecting people in greater society. And so, your question about when did I draw the parallel between police brutality and client mistreatment was within reading the Cornelius Frederick story. I mean, to me, it couldn't be any more obvious. He's saying, I can't breathe while being choked to death ultimately by authority figures. That is exactly what happened to George Floyd, right? And so to me, it really slapped me in the face. The comparison, it was one of those things. It's like, oh my goodness. Yes, police brutality is extremely problematic, and that needs to be addressed in and of its own right. But also, as behavior analysts, we need to sort of make sure our backyard is taken care of as well, and making sure that when ultimately we're the ones responsible for our clients' welfare, that the same issues that are affecting people in greater society are prevented and dealt with, and our clients are protected when we're serving them.
One notable piece that I was thinking about when I read your paper and thinking about the discussion of police brutality throughout, this past year, is that police aren't adequately trained in restraint procedures. They have a little bit, right? But they have different techniques because, quote unquote, they might have more, like aggressive clients. I would disagree heartedly, but that's,
right.
Me, right?
Nor are they the police's clients.
Right, yeah.
as well.
And then so my initial thought was, I wonder if Lakeside Academy had any indication on their website that the therapists were trained in restraints and how to respond to emergency crisis. And so I actually looked it up. I couldn't sleep last night after reading that paper either. So, and they did say that their staff were trained, and this was not in line with the training that they received, that restraint should only have been used in emergency procedures and not in this type of procedure where throwing food is, not that serious. At all serious, one might argue, right?
Right.
And I thought that was, telling that it also drives those same parallels where it's, something that's aversive and effective is probably overused.
Right. If you can stomach it, and if you're so inclined, the video of the strategy is actually available online. And so you can watch the escalation, the ultimately the staff escalating the situation. When Cornelius is throwing the sandwich, as someone who's worked with a great number of individuals who engage in aggression and property destruction, I think watching the video, it couldn't be any more evident that Cornelius is throwing the sandwich in really no aggressive manner whatsoever. He lightly sort of tosses the sandwich. Honestly, even using the word throw is probably painting the wrong picture. It really is more like a sandwich toss or a piece of bread toss.
And who hasn't done that? right? Who hasn't thrown a sandwich? I threw a whole thing of taco cheese when I was around his age and got sent to the principal's office right at somebody's face. But I threw it like it was a big throw.
Wow.
Who hasn't done that?
Right. Exactly. And so to watch the video, to watch him literally toss a piece of bread, and then a direct care staff member who was quite large, quite literally shove him onto the ground, and then, watch three adults wrestling with Cornelius on the ground. It's the whole story is upsetting, but watching the video is gut-wrenching.
Cody, one thing that I appreciated in kind of the thesis of your article and sort of, reviewing like what are the kind of ongoing kind of maintaining variables that are similar between police brutality, between client mistreatment. I mean, I just appreciated that content as a whole, because I know my knee-jerk reaction to reading, kind of starting the article, reading about Cornelius, was I sort of focused on the small factors. Like, he said he couldn't breathe. Well, I do a lot of training with de-escalation techniques. And in Mass State law, if someone says they can't breathe, you have to end a restraint. So I was focusing on these like nitty-gritty little details. And I realized all I was doing was sort of like the white fragility thing of like, oh, well, that would never happen to me or any of the staff I trained because we use proper techniques. And I really was missing the point for like 3 pages in. And then, when you started talking more about, the areas related to sort of say racial bias, I really had to bring myself back. And it was difficult. So I certainly encourage anyone who's reading this, if you do what I did and sort of focus on how, that would never happen to me, you're reading the article wrong, and you should probably go back and take a second look, because there's a lot more to it than just the idea of how to use restraint properly. It's not so simple as a training error, though. We can acknowledge that there was likely a training error as well. There's a lot more to it, to the topic than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we sort of incorporate or sort of account for training errors or lack of training within one of the risk factors, the ineffective intervention, which could be sort of a umbrella category to include aspects like that. And ultimately looking at, okay, yes, ineffective intervention, ineffective training. Yeah, of course, that is one of the many risk factors that could lead to mistreatment and abuse. But there are certainly other risk factors that are going to be associated with something like that. And so when I was sort of obsessed with this story, and I suppose I shouldn't say when, because to this day I'm still quite obsessed with it, I wanted to figure out really what were the major issues that could go wrong in a situation, and look at what are the risk factors in any given situation for the clients we serve. And so I don't think we could have possibly covered every single risk factor for client mistreatment, especially given, the shortage or disparity of research on this topic. And so we basically looked at 4 major risk factors that we identified through looking at commonly discussed risk factors for police brutality, and sort of used those as an analogy to say, here are variables that are well known, that are commonly discussed as factors contributing to police brutality. Are those variables that could potentially lead to client mistreatment? And so the paper, what we are attempting to do anyway, is talking about that comparison, right? Here's racial bias. Here's how it sort of is observed and prevalent in police brutality. How can that be seen in direct care context within behavior analysis, and where are the risk factors there? And so we kind of explored those areas within the paper.
So, Cody, I want our audience to make sure that they're on the edge of their seats, because we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to get into the details of those risk factors. All right, everyone, if you're listening, keep on listening. We will be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we're back talking with Dr. Cody Morris about his article on police brutality and client mistreatment. But before we get into those risk factors that Cody and his co-author, Nicole Hollins, discovered in their research. I want to make sure that all of you listeners out there know that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. And by listening to an episode of the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening to the episode, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus, GET-CEUS, and enter in 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first one right now, and it is flamingo. Flamingo. Had to look at the spelling on that one. Flamingo. It is the
smelly bird.
It is a bird. Technically, it is I believe, a white bird who is pink because of the shrimp the flamingo eats.
Interesting.
I went to a zoo once. Flamingo.
They're smelly.
I've never gotten that close. They stand on 1 foot. You get a plastic one. Anyway, enough about flamingos. Let's get into the actual conversation here. So, Cody, we teased everybody that you were going to share all the risk factors that, well, maybe not all but the ones that you and Nicole had sort of identified as risk factors behind client mistreatment that had parallels in police brutality and citizen mistreatment. So let's just kind of get into the ones you identified, sort of what research there is, what research there still needs to be, and then hopefully we can kind of continue the conversation as to what are the next steps for behavior analysis and for listeners out there.
That's good. The 4 risk factors that we focused on for this paper were racial bias, warrior mentality, lack of transparency and accountability, and ineffective intervention. Now, like you alluded to and like we talked about earlier, this is in no way, shape, or form a comprehensive list of every single risk factor related to police brutality. I know that's an incredibly complicated topic, as well as client mistreatment. These are 4, I think, pretty big, well written about topics that we sort of narrowed in on.
So I guess let's start with, possibly the biggest one, and certainly the one of the risk factors that there is not going to be, here are the 3 things that you can do to end today. And that would be racial bias. Sort of what did you find in terms of, how did you define racial bias and sort of looking at the research? And then what did you see as kind of the impact that would translate into settings like those, Cornelius Fredericks unfortunately was in?
Right. So I don't think I have to really make the argument that racial bias affects police brutality. I think that's well discussed in mass media and everything there. So I won't spend too much time talking about that. But I will focus in on what our definition was and how we see it potentially as a risk factor within the direct care setting. And so we borrowed the definition of the Hewer, I'm not 100% sure how you say the last name, but let's go with the Hewer 2019, who defined racial bias through a behavioral lens as saying a behavior that is influenced by cues that function as an indicator of a social group to which others belong, which to me, I sort of interpret as basically you're attuning to discriminative stimuli associated with someone's group rather than discriminative stimuli that are going to be more appropriate for any given context. You're allowing the stimuli of someone's racial group potentially to sort of overshadow and control your behavior. And in the case of police brutality, of course, we see that play out by more aggressive interactions with racial minorities. In particular, Black individuals are typically targeted with more aggressive actions from police officers. But in the direct care setting, what we like to look at is where we can potentially see racial bias play out within behavior analysis. Now, there is basically absolutely no data, at least currently, that are published in this area, and I certainly hope that people are working on that now. And so it's difficult to say definitively, like, this is where you see racial bias in ABA settings. But we can look at some related settings to give us an idea as to how racial bias may play out within behavior analytic programs. And so a lot of behavior analysts focus on school-based services. And so we can look at racial bias data from public school settings to give us an idea as to, again, where racial biases may work out. And kudos to my co-author, Nicole Hollins, again, for doing a lot of the legwork in this area. but we looked at in school settings, African American children are targeted for disciplinary actions at something like 3 times the rate of their white peers. Right. And so right away, you can begin to see that just based on color of skin, you're going to see that individuals are experiencing more punitive techniques and interventions, which of course are going to put them at greater risk of losing out on learning opportunities, right? If they're getting removed from the setting, or stigmatization, and all sorts of other risk factors, right? And then, if you look at some of the other risk factors related to the settings, if you're working in school settings, you may experience in some of the same contingencies that are shaping schools to ultimately engage in racial bias toward African American children. The limited generalizability of evidence-based practices is another area where you can see racial bias, right? When all or most of the participants of evidence-based practices are white or not minority children or clients or participants, you're going to see a skew in the type of interventions, and you may not see them generalize over to the groups who aren't represented. And so there's a big issue there. And then we can also see huge disparities in ultimately the direct care workforce related to the implementation of behavior analysis, right? And so if we look at Rbt Racial Demographics, you can see that there's 46% that are identify as white, 29% as Hispanic or Latinx, and 11% as Black. And so that is not representative, especially with the Black RBTs, is not representative of the population in the United States. And so we can see a disparity there and a lack of representation, which can lead to issues.
Right. And it gets even worse the higher up the chain you go, right? So when you're looking at the demographics that I would like to point out were only available last year, 2020, at the request of many behavior analysts.
What year, Jackie?
2020
okay,
is my favorite. Who signed a petition, right? That's the first time we heard about that.
Mm-hmm.
It's really shocking to see. I mean, I guess it's actually not shocking. It's not surprising when you look at like who's working with you, right? It's not surprising, but I think that's another whole topic that we need to at some point delve into. But when I was thinking about this issue of racial bias, I am not surprised that we don't have data in ABA settings, right? Because one of the first articles on cultural competence was only published in 2016, right? So that's like not that long ago.
Yeah. Although if we pull from the larger educational literature, there is pretty good amount of evidence of racial bias within school systems and educational settings. So a good one that we actually, I think, talked about with Liz Fong in episode 104 is Salen and Taylor, Cultural Perspectives, Missing Pieces in the Functional Assessment Process, which was published in Intervention in School and Clinic 2002. But it goes through differences that are seen within disciplinary referrals, diagnosis, etc. for students of color. And then if listeners are interested in this, I also assigned for my students an podcast episode from Radiolab called The Miseducation of Larry P. And there's a 5 podcast series on intelligence and the idea of IQ. That's kind of a hollow term. That particular episode breaks down IQ test bias and talks about it in the context of this one example. So it's really good if anyone wants to check that out too.
We are not sponsored by Radiolab.
Yeah, they're our competitors. We gotta be worried about them.
Oh yeah, I'm sure
coming for our lunch.
I'm sure they're pretty worried about us.
Oh yeah. Next time I see that host of Radiolab, whoever that is,
Jad Albumrod.
No offense. I'm gonna punch up a little bit. Radiolab, I think it's a little overproduced. Do you want my opinion? A little too many crazy cuts and like little zoomies.
I love it.
It's a little too much for me. No, thank you. Radiolab.
Cut the segue on this podcast.
Yeah, right. Cody, have you thought about the implications of racial bias related to the new ethics code 2022, right? And now they've infused some more specific language surrounding awareness of culture and diversity. Have you thought?
Yeah, I've spent a little bit of time thinking about that. I'm actually working on another project within this area, again with Nicole Hollins and Anita Lee. And within that paper, we bring up the change in the ethics code. And I suppose a quick summary of at least my interpretation of what we ended up writing in that paper was that looking at the previous versions of the ethics code, and this actually goes all the way back to the first, and they didn't call it an ethics code, but the guidelines. I don't remember exactly what they were calling them when they were first issued. I think it was guidelines, ethical guidelines.
They were just like the one paper you should read from the BACP back in 1998 when they had nothing and no one.
Exactly. And so whenever they issued that first ethical guideline, they kept basically the same exact language all the way up until this most recent version that we're now getting. And where you see the old versions, it says basically, when there are differences of age, gender, race, etc., behavior analysts obtain training, experience, consultation, or supervision is necessary, which is, I guess, an overall, I suppose, a good thing, but it's very reactive, right? Only when you ultimately run into a shortcoming should you do anything about it. And ultimately, my favorite part of the new ethics code is that, to quote it almost, behavior analysts actively underline, italicize, bold, however you like, emphasizing actively engage in professional development activities to acquire knowledge and skills related to cultural responsiveness and diversity. So, in my opinion, the new code is flipping it, and we're taking a much more proactive approach to diversity, which I think is only going to help our field in so many ways.
I'm hoping so. And I love the addition of the awareness of personal biases and challenges, right? Because they had that there too in like a hidden place in guideline 1 and the 2014 guidelines. But now it's like popping out on its own. It's like, I'm a new woman.
I definitely felt like I was reading that book. Have you ever read that House of Leaves book where like there's a whole another book in the footnotes? I definitely felt like that with the old code of like, if you look really closely, you can see all these great recommendations. It's like they're hidden between. If you take the second letter of each one, you'll find where they tell you should be interested in diversity and paying attention to your biases. But it is just, they're like, why do we do that? Let's just throw it out there and say, hey, everybody, you should 100% do this, and you shouldn't just wait for it. Like you were saying, Cody, you shouldn't just kind of wait for it to happen. Like at some point, someone will tell me I should pay attention to biases, and that's when I'll do it. No, you should be doing it on your own, actively, like you said, actively, bold. It's
good that it doesn't have to be like a word search.
Yeah.
To get that
I mean, it was fun, but it wasn't really helpful.
House of Leaves.
Yes.
This is by Mark
Danilowski.
I'll do it. I got 3 books in line.
It's like a bazillion pages. Plus, there's one in the footnotes. So,
Right.
You got all these books.
Phew, can't wait.
I know. I definitely don't want to leave discussion of racial bias. And I think maybe we can come back around at kind of the end when we're talking about some solutions. But I want to make sure we can talk about some of those other risk factors. Specifically, Cody, I really want to jump to the warrior cop or the warrior direct care staff concept. Was that a term that you just were familiar with in research on sort of some of the issues behind police brutality, that you had sort of anecdotal evidence really related to direct care staff? Was it something that you sort of found in other research that just sort of made sense in kind of the discussion that you were having and the research that you were presenting in your paper? Kind of where did that kind of come into play?
Yeah, so the actual term is warrior cop. And so the warrior cop, it comes directly from work done looking at the progressive militarization of police in America and sort of the mentality behind that. I have altered the term, or adjusted or adapted the term, I should say, to fit, I think, direct care settings, and changing it from warrior cop, which obviously the cop piece isn't so applicable, to warrior mentality, which is sort of honing in on the sort of attitude, I suppose, that underlies the warrior cop and show how it may affect direct care settings. And to be honest with you, this is a concept that I've been sort of obsessed with since I got into the field of working with individuals with developmental disabilities. In my very first job doing direct care work, It was sort of in a group setting where we were managing groups of individuals with developmental disabilities. And it was during a summer. I was working when I was an undergraduate. And I was managing a group of students, and I was just feeling like, oh, I'm starting to get the hang of this and feeling good about sort of the work that I was doing. It was a little overwhelming at first. And once I got it down, I ran into another coworker on a break. And I was like talking about, I'm starting to feel like I'm comfortable with this. I sort of get the feel for what the responsibilities are and how to do this effectively. And he sort of scoffed at me and said something along the lines of, you're not really a therapist here until you've had to physically manage someone. You're not really doing this job until you've ultimately physically managed an individual. And I thought, even at that time, that's a bit of a backwards idea, right? Because if I'm doing effective, proactive interventions, I should be probably avoiding most of the need to have to do something like a restraint or a physical management procedure. And so the fact that I saw it sort of flip, and the idea that is, you're a good therapist ultimately if you are physically managing people, seemed off to me. And so I sort of became very interested in researching that attitude in general. I actually have a friend of mine whose wife was a police officer. And we were talking about that story in front of her. And she told me when she was a police officer that it was the same attitude, in the sense that the police officers, at least at her station that she worked with, had special status related to police officers who had to use their gun, or at least draw their gun in the line of duty. And so there was this thing of, you're not a real cop until you've had to pull your gun. And, that got me interested specifically in the police side of things. And I found a book sort of focused on the warrior cop. And then I sort of adapted that term to fit our field.
I can see it. When I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't been the warrior cop because I do not like physical altercations at all. Mm-hmm. But I have seen that when working in, residential facilities with really highly challenging behavior. When I had went back and looked at the contingencies surrounding, restraints and this notion of the warrior mentality, it reminded me of like an avoidance of programming, right? So when I look back at contingencies, like, there's going to be some slight challenging behavior. If I engage in restraint, then I actually don't have to do the hard tasks that I don't know how to do, as like run programming and like be creative. And that's what I saw anyway. And and then the misrepresentation of force, right, from the side of the therapist.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm like, I'm so strong. I can like push this kid down. Look at me.
Yeah. In reading, the article, Cody, certainly, everyone's knee-jerk reaction hopefully was, and really should be, like, this is gross. Like, this is inappropriate. Like, your reaction of, I did not get into the field to help people. I'm never going to be happy or proud of being a part of physical management. But, you lay out so many of the sort of hidden incentives that are likely in place and that would maintain such an attitude with direct care staff, potentially could even maintain them with behavior analysts, though, as we're not usually, frontline staff, it's hopefully less likely, but makes perfect sense because, you have the social praise or the kind of the social cachet that comes from having been involved. Like, wow, you really handled that situation. You're so tough. You bring up the idea of someone, maybe they get some time off, or you had to work with the hardest student in all this physical management. Here is the most fun student, in the classroom or in the residence. So you can work with them for the weekends shift, or, hey, you need some time off because that was a really tough situation, really tough restraint you were in there. So you should get some time off. And, in reading that, it just felt so strained that incentives for having a more appropriate therapeutic approach could be so out of whack.
Absolutely. And I've been talking about this concept in particular for years and years and years. It's one of those things, if you've met me, like if we bumped into each other at ABAI, I'm probably finding some way to squeeze this idea into the conversation. And
I hope so. I like that.
And every time I do, everyone I've ever spoken with, it's like, yes, I've seen this, I've experienced this. This is something that I think is extremely prevalent within our field, and there's so many, I think, good examples of warrior mentality. To maybe give an easy one or a simple one that actually Stephanie Peterson, my grad school mentor, talked about when I brought this idea up to her, was she was working in some setting, perhaps a school, where they were working with a client who engaged in physical aggression in the form of punching, and he had an extremely, extremely slow wind up. Like, she's like, he literally punches in slow motion. Like, you would have to be asleep for him to actually be able to connect with you. He's just that slow of a punch. And one of the direct care staff at some point came up to her and whatever administrators were involved with the setting and was like, yeah, the client punched me. I need to leave work, and I need some time off to recuperate. And they're like, what are you talking about? Watch the video of this guy with the slow wind up and this direct care staff, and they literally watched the direct care staff lean his face into the client's fist, and then ultimately got 3 or whatever paid days off, right? And so you can see where incentives related to time off can come into it. Of course, the social recognition. If you're not careful as a behavior analyst, and I see this a lot when I consult, a lot of praise and attention is delivered when someone has to do a physical management procedure. And it's tough, right? I mean, a lot of times we do have to use physical management. It's not pretty. And perhaps staff that do have to go through that do need, some more attention or whatever. But if you're not careful, you're going to create a contingency where people are getting all this attention and affection and praise for doing physical management procedures and not for doing effective proactive interventions to prevent the issue from occurring in the first place. And what are you going to see? You're going to see matching law. People are going to allocate, they're responding to what gets them, that recognition, praise, the benefits that may come along with that, like time off or special cases, things like that. And that's to say nothing of the sort of social media standpoint of people posting the bite marks and the bruises and the torn clothes and getting all of that social reinforcers to come along with that.
I was surprised to read that. I don't think I've seen that happen on social media, but that seems very upsetting to me.
Yeah.
That happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've seen it a little bit. Nicole, I think, has seen it a little bit more. I'm not super involved or engaged on social media. I think she's probably she's more popular than I am, is what I'm trying to say.
I'm with you, Cody. So this is not my thing.
I was trying to talk around it. Let's cut straight to the point. Nicole is infinitely cooler than I am, has way more Facebook friends, and I think has seen a little bit more of this. But even with my limited interactions on social media, even I've seen it. And I've seen all the sort of praise and everything that come along with it. And again, I'm not trying to be hard on people and say if you got beat up at the job that, you shouldn't get some sympathy for that. But it's a razor thin line, I think, toward incentivizing actually behaviors that are going to lead to the bumps, bruises, and sort of battle scars that you get to brag about. I've also been in settings when I was in grad school, again, a little bit more social back then, where I'd be going out with friends, groups of behavior analysts, and almost everyone talks about the physical restraints and stuff. Nobody's talking about, oh, I did this proactive strategy and it worked extremely well. I mean, I suppose people are, but it's those battle stories that seem to be much more prevalent and reinforced in those social settings. I don't think that's reinforcing the correct behavior.
I'm with you there, Cody. And I know you even mentioned in the article that, is there a way, could there be a way to sort of turn that warrior mentality into some sort of, more functional in terms of, just being able to be like more professional about being in a restraint? Or, wouldn't it be great if people were telling those stories of like, oh yeah, I'd use physical management, but man, it was only 30 seconds. I used the technique properly. I was then able to de-escalate using my, verbal skills and was able to think about, get back to the treatment within a few minutes. And then the rest of the day went great. That's But, I'm even telling that story. I'm like, oh, no one wants to hear that story. That's a boring story. I want to hear the really exciting story. But
also don't talk about your clients if you go outside.
Right. That's
okay. All right. Thanks for just putting, pin in my little metaphorical story balloon, Diana.
Sorry.
No, I agree. Obviously, maintain privacy and everything like that. At the same time, those stories, those conversations do occur. They shouldn't be occurring in the first place, but they do. And when they do occur, what is the social reinforcement being delivered contingent on? To me, anytime as a clinician, as a supervisor, I have to use any sort of physical management procedure, I see it as at least a sort of some level of a failure on my part to set up effective interventions to prevent that issue from occurring in the first place. I should have set up effective proactive procedures, training procedures, interventions to prevent that from occurring. Yes, interventions aren't going to be perfect all of the time. And occasionally, to protect people's safety, we're going to have to do physical management. I respect that, obviously. But those should only be happening on rare occasions when you're working on problem solving some of those other interventions that should be preventing it in the first place.
That's what we should be reinforcing, right? Like at the bar, being like, oh man, I was so creative by using the principles of behavior analysis and looking back and doing a literature review, and look, I extended this and all of these skills came. That's what we should be reinforcing.
Exactly. Like, okay, yep, that happened. That was rough. I'm sorry you had to do that. You did a nice job while you did it. But more importantly, let's talk about how you could have prevented that from occurring in the first place. What are some interventions, some ideas? Do we need to reassess something? What do we do next? Because we're not going to sit here and linger on, oh, I had to physically manage them and then do the same thing again next week. No, we had to do something that was unpleasant for everyone involved. Let's prevent it in the future.
I've started, when I think about the 3-term contingency, I used to think of it as like A, B, and C, and like in my mind, all of those letters are like the same size. But now I've started to think about it with a really big A, and then like a medium size B, and then a really small C. Because if we're looking at a challenging situation that's a crisis level, our C options are really limited, right? There's not that many things you can do in that moment. But our A options for the next time around are much, much, much larger. And we can do so many different things in antecedent areas, right, related to motivating operations, stimulus control, enhancing the environment, etc., that could hopefully prevent us from being in that really tightly bound C area where we don't actually have many options available.
Right. I like that, Diana.
I 100% agree with that. And I think, I like the sort of escalation curves that are, spread around behavior analysis a little bit, really emphasizing how do you cut the behavior off before it even gets to the level where you need to do a serious consequence, right? And then, of course, that's not going to work 100% of the time, but hopefully it cuts off a percentage of it, right? So maybe your sort of first level, if you're thinking about a triage, your first level of intervention cuts off 60% of behaviors from escalating, and then the next level cuts it off. And then, of course, some are going to slip through. And in that situation, you try to reduce reinforcement as much as you possibly can. You may end up utilizing some form of punishment procedure, try to, decrease that behavior. But in applied settings, that's really messy, and that's not going to typically work, at least in my experience. It's going to really work long term.
So in terms of, we've talked about warrior mentality, we've talked about racial bias. I think the other risk factors that you discussed in terms of looking at improved transparency and accountability, and then the use of ineffective interventions, kind of in reading those, Cody, while I know they are two separate factors, there is sort of a connection between the two of them, in that a lot of places that tend to focus on use of ineffective interventions are probably the places that will also have pretty poor levels of transparency. But could you sort of speak to how those factors kind of came into the overall discussion in your paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, these two certainly interplay off of one another. I would say really all of the risk factors are interrelated. And one of the statements we make in the paper is, you may have a situation where, let's say, warrior mentality isn't an issue, in your clinic or setting, wherever you're working. That doesn't mean that these other three or unspoken risk factors can sort of creep up and create mistreatment. I after having published this paper, a lot of people now send me sort of clips or articles about abuses that are identified in ABA settings. And, just recently someone sent me a video about a child in, I believe it was Arizona or somewhere in the Southwest, who was abused. It was, to my knowledge, a Caucasian male child with severe autism, from what I can tell, that was abused, right? So racial bias probably wasn't, a contributing factor in that situation, likely. But the other factors, or again, maybe unspoken factors, can add up to create mistreatment. And so to circle back into the lack of transparency and accountability and ineffective intervention, again, these are taken right from literature just talking about police brutality, right? And so lack of transparency and accountability is one of the major risk factors in police brutality. This is why there's been a push for things like the body cams, which of course are abused, right? So as a lot of people don't love the idea of the body cams because the police selectively use the footage, right? And so they'll actually, the footage disappears when there is a brutality issue, and it appears when it serves them well, and this person was being aggressive or whatever. But if you could actually achieve undiluted footage of police interactions with individuals, we would have a much clearer story and much more evidence and data to identify when there's police brutality or not, right? When, of course, they can sort of divert or manipulate the system. That's not about, I'm not talking about, their manipulation, but I'm saying if we had direct footage, that would of course be a good thing. And when we have that information, that's how we create change. One of the quotes we put in the paper, one of the citations we put in the paper is from the Human Rights Watch, who ultimately say, the only reforms that occur in policing related to police brutality are all brought about when there's a high profile case that garners public attention, right? Really, no one in the mass media was talking about any of the police reforms recently until the George Floyd incident, right? And now we're all talking about it and trying to figure out how can we fix issues related to police brutality. And so we need that transparency. That's going to help us ultimately hold, in the case of police brutality, police accountable. But switching over to behavior analysis, we also need to have transparency and accountability. And there are a lot of measures in place doing that exactly, right? In IEP, you list, you're writing and documenting your goals and showing the evidence of addressing those goals throughout your treatment with your particular client. We have reporting requirements to insurance agencies and other licensing factors. We've got the BACB and the ethics code and reporting to the BACB. So there are a lot of really, really good sort of reporting mechanisms that improves transparency. But we don't have 100% transparency. And sort of an example I like to give when talking about transparency is when stakeholders are invited in to observe clients receive services. I think that's a phenomenal opportunity for clinics, schools, wherever you're working, to sort of improve or lean into transparency, right? Having stakeholders come in and see what the day in and day out looks like, that's a great thing. However, like police manipulating their body cam footage, in my experience, clinics tend to completely change the way that they're delivering services and what their even their clinic looks like when people come in. As a sort of someone who does a lot of consultation now, going into various schools, clinics, etc., it's abundantly obvious to me that people have been prepped well before I got there And people tell me that if it's my students that invited me in, or even like teachers in a public school, like, yeah, the principal told everybody, blah, 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 blah. That's not helping me do my job as a consultant. It's not helping your transparency. How are we ever going to help you identify issues with your service delivery if you're cherry picking what we see? It's a major problem. And I think that autism centers, schools, group homes, whatever, clinics, if you want to make sure you are avoiding risk factors related to client mistreatment, one of the most important things you can do is ramp up transparency. And that includes inviting stakeholders in to observe services as often as you can. And I know there's privacy issues there because it's not just, one stakeholder's child receiving services, but, working on those issues, inviting people in and not prepping your staff and saying, hey, parents are coming in today, so the room better be clean and you better be doing this, this, and this with them. That's not helping. And if you feel like you have to prep someone for a stakeholder visiting, guess what? You should have been doing that the entire time, right? If you're like, oh, the parents are coming in, we've got to change our behavior. Why is your behavior not like that 100% of the time? That's scary to me.
Yeah, to some extent, those passages sort of reminded me of, when the supervision requirements had started being updated and really looking at like, how often are you supervising your staff? Making sure it's not just the same time every time, so everyone's ready for you to come. Make sure if you come to watch something, you come back the next day when it's unprepared. And maybe you mix in some scheduled and some unscheduled visits, with the goal being, ideally everyone would be saying, all right, a parent's coming to watch us. I can't wait to show them what an amazing program I work for and how great a therapist I am and how well I exude behavior analysis and appropriate, ethical principles from every pore. However, that is typically not. It's usually, okay, everybody, come on, we got to get together. We got someone important coming in, like the people who are receiving services aren't that important, so we'll do whatever we want. But, their mom or dad or the president of a major corporation who might give us money is coming, so we really want to make sure to impress them. You're right, though, Cody. If you can't say, I can't wait till someone comes in because we're going to be sure to impress them. If you can't say that right now about the place you're looking at, don't worry about the visit right now. You need to go back and rethink how you're doing things because you're doing them wrong.
Right. I think true accountability is you're doing the right thing no matter if you have an audience or not. Right. And so when you are labeling your own behaviors as needing to change when you get an audience, that's a problem. Our clients should be our audience, right? Even though they often don't have the abilities to communicate about certain things or advocate for themselves or relay what's happening in the center to others, we should be seeing them as the absolute most important audience and making sure we're giving them our A game 100% of the time, right? Oh, their parents are coming in. We need to clean. Why haven't you cleaned for the clients? Oh, the parents are coming in. We need to make sure all the program books are ready and the data is graphed and everything like that. Why are you not preparing your programs for the client? Why are you not graphing that data and analyzing it for your client's benefit? It's scary to me when people get sort of under the contingency control of, oh, we've got the 4-week check-in with the parents, so that's when we graph the data. I hope you're graphing the data as frequently as you need to so that you can make treatment decisions based off of that. It's not something that you just report to the parents. We're behavior analysts. How are we making treatment decisions if we're not graphing data?
Exactly.
I love that they added that you have to graphically analyze your data in the ethics code.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that.
It's good to be there. So, Cody, I know we have 4 risk factors. We've sort of just touched on all of them a little bit, and like you said at the top, these aren't necessarily the only risk factors. Some of the research on each of the individual risk factors, some of it's a little more robust than others, but it's not like all of the answers are out there. And I think we went over a few answers, but I would love to go over a couple more in our dissemination station. I just want to draw out my dissemination station intro too, because I can see you getting ready, Jackie. Of I'm about to gonna make the sound.
I'm either gonna make the sound or I'm like, what's happening?
You've been trained so well when you hear that dissemination station to get this train sound effect going.
That's so true.
So, Cody, when we look at risk factors, when we look at possible solutions, when we look at areas where there are no solutions, I would love to hear your opinion on for listeners out there, what is the low-hanging fruit? What is here's the risk factor that you can, you don't need to lose a ton of sleep tonight. You can wake up tomorrow and immediately put into practice. And then B, what is the risk factor that we just don't have enough information and we really need to be doing a lot more exploration to find the mediating factors, much less an effective, societal level treatment?
Right. So I'm gonna answer that question in reverse order, if you don't mind.
That's totally fine.
So I think the thing that we need to do, and this should be no surprise to the behavior analysts listening, is, drumroll please, collect data on this issue. Right? I mean,
Cody, I would have been mad if that wasn't your answer, to be honest.
Right? I mean, on all the issues, that's the thing, right? So I think we've had a lot of really good calls to collect data on diversity matters within the field of behavior analysis, and I wholeheartedly support that. And I think that's important for all the reasons listed in the various articles that talk about that, as well as preventing mistreatment. But I also think we need to look at things like the other risk factors we talked in the paper, the warrior mentality, the transparency and accountability, and the use of ineffective interventions, and looking at them, because ultimately I think they all sort of intersect to create potentially very problematic amalgamations of risk factors and potentially leading to mistreatment. And so data collection all around is the answer to that. And I think that's I'm sure very cliche. I'm sure you guys hear that a lot on the show. Data collection.
We should.
Yeah, as you should.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of centers should do that. I suspect that centers will not do that unless they are required to do that, and perhaps the various organizations that accredit or license centers should consider requiring information related to some of this information. And of course, behavior analysts should take it on their own to take on some of these topics as well. But I think there are so many issues that behavior analysts are interested in that issues related to data collections can sort of be washed away if they're not required. And so I would encourage anyone with the power to require these things to require these things. In terms of low-hanging fruit, like things that behavior analysts can immediately take on, I'll see if I can't spread this answer out among sort of the various risk factors. So looking at racial bias, I think obviously looking at things like teaching cultural competence, making sure that there are the anti-racism is embedded within programs' mission and vision. And by the way, Adele Najowski provides a lot of really helpful, actionable items in a paper she published in 2020 that talks about like graduate program preparation.
Such a good article.
So good. And it applies beyond that. It applies beyond graduate programs. I think a lot of clinics could look at that and go, yeah, like let's embed anti-racism within our program mission and include cultural competence training and make sure that we're providing experience to diverse populations, that we're requiring discussions of cultural variables. I think would all be things that are pretty easily done. Perhaps getting experience with diverse populations may not be so easy unless you have access. And that kind of relates to maybe one of the larger issues, as well as one of the things we need to take on as a field in terms of racial bias is making sure that there are no major disparities in the clients that we're serving, right? We need to make sure that our services are available to any and all individuals, and that we're not seeing, for example, Black children with autism not receiving the same services that white children with autism are receiving, and so forth. To look at some of the other risk factors, like warrior mentality, the first thing that anyone can do, any BCBA, is consider your own verbal behavior in responses to people who are using physical management procedures. Now, of course, I'm not saying, shame people who use physical management procedures. We all have to use them at some point. But what are you incentivizing? And when somebody does that, are you encouraging them, afterward, go, okay, nice job, you did all that appropriately. That was great to see. Are you encouraging them to think about how they can prevent that from in the future? Because to me, every single time you're having to use physical management, a serious physical management, you're at risk of hurting that client, right? I mean, even with the best training and the best procedures, and you've got a bunch of people helping, every time you're putting hands on, there's at least a minimal level of risk related to hurting that person. And so we should be doing everything we possibly can to prevent the need for that. I'm not saying wipe it out. I'm not saying we should have laws that say we can't physically manage. Our jobs would be impossible without it, but we should take it very seriously and try to prevent it as much as possible. In terms of transparency and accountability, invite stakeholders in, right? They may not be able to observe every session. Get their feedback on things. Make sure that you're having continuous conversations with them to make sure you understand their perspective and they understand every single thing you're doing, and you could feel comfortable at any minute them dropping by and going, hey, I'm here to watch. Is that cool? And go, absolutely, that's cool. And not feel, oh gosh, I wish I had done this or this. So you should have been doing those things when they weren't watching. And then on the intervention piece, making sure that you, as a behavior analyst, you're setting up direct care staff to implement effective intervention. That includes effective proactive and training procedures so that ideally physical management is never needed, but then also effective reactive procedures, right? Things that are going to allow the staff members to safely and effectively manage a escalated situation in which they have to use some sort of physical procedure.
Mm-hmm. And know when to do that,
and
right?
Know when to do it, right, exactly. Making sure that physical management is an absolute last resort that is only used in very specific circumstances, and making sure they have the skill set and the tools to do so many other things to de-escalate a situation before having to use physical management.
Right.
I think that point specifically, I know speaks to a lot of my practice, Cody, in that I do for pretty much every district I've worked with and consulted. I've had a role in terms of what is our de-escalation and really trying to take a look at, is our focus on how we can de-escalate without physical management, and really teaching a lot of staff to discriminate. This is a situation that you do not need to use physical management, and you will feel uncomfortable, like you're not doing anything effective, because sometimes that is what de-escalation is. It is waiting. It is making sure everyone is safe. And it is saying, oh man, I wish it were tomorrow when I was getting together with the team to talk about what is the effective intervention that we need to get in place, and why is it going to be in place, and how are we going to track it? And I want to get there. But right now I'm in the place where professionals who aren't used to this, or who are inconvenienced, quote unquote, inconvenienced by the actions of one individual, they're sort of like, could you do something here? Could you do some magic and make them stop throwing bread or whatever sort of, as someone who's been in the field a long time, you sort of look at it and say, this is not a serious behavior. I understand why it's frustrating, and I understand that it's not ideal, but there are so many options. And just making sure that the staff who often get called to be a part of that can discriminate. This is an uncomfortable situation for me, but it is not a dangerous situation, versus this is a dangerous situation in which physical management unfortunately is going to have to be a temporary component of our response for the safety of the individual, for the safety of other people around. And it will be over very soon, because our goal is to move on to effective interventions. But like you said, that sense of, if only I'd done XYZ, we wouldn't be in this situation. And I feel like I've done a disservice. So I'm going to come up with a better plan. I missed something. I think that's something anyone who does, any sort of training on, whether you're using, one of the kind of published ones, whether you have your own, internal, direct care physical management system. If you don't have a robust section on everything that's not the physical management, then I would say you're doing it wrong. You're not really getting to the point of why you're there.
My point that I wanted to get around to is I would encourage readers to read in the cumulative record Skinner's piece on the compassionate care of the retarded. That is a horrible name, right? But that is the name of it.
That was the name at the time.
1959. It was republished in 1972. But I think it takes, what we've said of here are the situations in which client mistreatment will happen, and looks at it like how can we promote a culture of compassion to our clients. Mm-hmm. And so that would be a really fun read.
Cumulative record?
I know. I'm so sorry. But it is I think it's a really good Skinner article that poses a lot of potential solutions or potential, conceptual thoughts as a starting point to develop a culture that will reinforce the behavior that we want to see as good. Like maybe, talking about skill acquisition, promoting cultural sensitivity and responsiveness, while also punishing the behaviors that we don't necessarily want to see.
And then when you're done reading Cumulative Record at the beach, you can just lay it out and it's a table for your picnic,
Right.
Just use all that space.
Now I never have to read it again. But I think it's a good one. So
yes.
I agree. I think it's a good article. And I think that part of what Skinner taps into in that article is that, I'm not going to use his words, but individuals with developmental disabilities are the most vulnerable population imaginable, and they cannot really effectively advocate for themselves. And so what are we as behavior analysts doing to make sure that we're enabling them to voice their opinions about their treatment in any way, shape, or form as best as we can to enable autonomy and independence? I mean, if you're not targeting independence in behavior analysis, what are you really doing? Isn't that really
get out of here?
Isn't that the goal of behavior analysis, is to build independent skills, right? And autonomy ultimately, really no matter what branch you're in. That's what we're doing here, I think. So how are we channeling that attitude in every interaction with our client? How are we enabling them to be as independent and voice their opinion about things as much as possible throughout? And if you can do that, if you can tap into that, I think you're going to undercut so many of these risk factors related to mistreatment, because you're sort of switching that view. You're taking on that sort of humble behaviorism or that compassionate behavior analytic approach, which is going to, I think, eliminate so many of these risk factors.
Totes my goats.
I sort of want to take. I think it was the comedian Michael Ian Black had a book. It was like a memoir called "You're Just Not Doing It Right," and I sort of want to steal that title and like write my own little like supervision memoir. You're just not doing it right, and just sort of go through and like what are the common mistakes that BCBAs have made in the past, and what are the red flags they're looking for. I feel like we use that phrase a lot tonight, or some sort of variation on that phrase tonight. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, what are you thinking here? But it's again, so much goes back to so much of these challenges are based on elaborate learning histories at the societal level, especially when we're talking about racial bias. That it's pretty reductive to say, you just shouldn't do that. That's not the way to do things. Like, that's great, but it goes much beyond just one individual, like acknowledging one problem that they have. It's not quite that simple, but there are definitely, and I appreciate Cody going through all the risk factors. There's something to start with for everyone that you can all wake up and get going on a few of them. Yeah. And I hope our listeners do.
Yeah. And behavior analysts, right? We care about action. It's great that if you got to this point of the podcast, you listened all the way through. Thank you for doing that. But we need to see action, right? We need to see these things implemented in our field, or we're not going to have a field for very much longer, right? If we do not take on some of these very complex and troubling issues, we're going to see case after case of a mistreated or abused client. And that's going to have potentially irreversible damage to our field. Think about the stuff we read in the Bailey and Birch book related to, Sunshine Psychiatric Hospital, whatever that was.
Sunland Miami scandal.
Sunland Miami scandal, right? I mean, that wasn't the sole contributing factor to sort of the anti-behavior modification push, but there were so many of those issues that were prevalent at that time that our field took a serious kick in the pants and sort of got pushed out of mainstream sort of consciousness and attention for quite some time. And really it took things like Let Me Hear Your Voice and some of the success with treating autism to get us back in good public standing. And if we're not careful, we're going to mess that up too. And I love behavior analysis, and by no way, shape, or form am I suggesting that behavior analysis is abusive at all. But we can't be in denial about the fact that people, behavior analysts, direct care staff, have the capability of abusing clients in the same way that a teacher does, in the same way that a police officer does, in the same way that a speech pathologist does. These are individual people who can potentially abuse the people they're serving. And so we need to take a look at that. There are abuses that happen in the realm of behavior analysis. My students talk to me a lot. They'll say, Cody, I saw this post on Facebook that said ABA is abusive. It was an individual with autism who said that they were abused by behavior analysts. What should I say about that? And I say they very well could have been abused by a behavior analyst. So behavior analysts are not immune to abusing people. We can abuse people. And, I think there's probably evidence to suggest we have, or individuals have, abused people. That doesn't mean the field is abusive. It means individuals within the field have abused people. And we can prevent that. And the way we prevent that is starting to look at these risk factors of mistreatment. And again, this paper, I think, is merely scratching the surface. I think a lot more work needs to be done in this area. And I think we need to channel some of the other attitudes that we're hearing written about, like the compassionate behavior analyst, the humble behaviorism, channel those things to ultimately reduce and prevent abuse within our field.
Well, Cody, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight and discussing your work. Thanks also to your co-author, Nicole, for her contributions to this paper. I think there have been a lot of things to cover, a lot of very important issues, and also a lot, like you said, a lot of action that can get started, and certainly a lot of action that will need to continue for some time to get at, some of the more complex issues with, higher level variables. But if there are individuals out there who would like to be in touch with you, it sounds like you've been getting maybe more, sad news stories than you were expecting before you published. So maybe you don't want too many more. But if people would like to reach out and, talk to you more about this research or future research, is there a place that they can find you? Absolutely. So and actually do send me any of the stories, published stories, news clips, whatever on this area. It can be, troubling for me to have to consume so much of, but I am working on trying to summarize a lot of this information and further work that I can share with others. And so if you're listening, you're like, oh yeah, there was a story in my town or whatever, by all means, please share it with me. You can find me, you can contact me through my email address, Cody, so CODY.Morris, MORRIS, at salve.edu. That's SALVE.edu. You can also find me if you just Google Cody Morris, Salve Regina University. It'll take you to my faculty page, and then it'll link to all my contact information there as well. Excellent. And if people enjoyed hearing you here, they can also hear you on episodes of the Bapcast as well, correct? That's right. Behavior Analysis in Practice, the podcast. We just recently wrapped season 1, so all those episodes are available on all the different streaming services, and we're getting close to releasing season 2. So yeah, check that out. Just look for Behavior Analysis in Practice, the podcast, type that in, and you'll find it. I'm sad that we don't have seasons. Our seasons are like you just want a vacation. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But yeah, you guys are on a continuous grind, which we're like season 1, 5 years in. I can't do what you guys do. For Bapcast, I group all the record. Like I did 6 interviews this week, and then I'll do all the editing at once, and I can't spread it out. It's too much. We talk about that sometimes, and then the idea of because I can't see, that's what I can't imagine loopy. Is doing 6 in a row. I feel like by number 6, I'm like, anyway, tell me about your paper. Oh, I'm taking a nap. You're the worst. So good for you for keeping the stamina up for all six in a row, because you got to keep a certain level of energy and inquisitiveness and everything going. So good on you.
I mean, I think maybe mine's the sprint, yours is the marathon. So I think you guys actually need the stamina. For me, it's get it all done in 1 week, and then I can not speak to anybody for 2 weeks while I edit and crawl into my cave.
Yeah, I guess it's just us too, so we can't get away from each other.
That's right.
That's true. Oh, Cody, thank you again so much for coming on tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Once again, a big thank you to Dr. Cody Morris for coming on the show and sharing his research with us. Before we wrap up, a couple pieces of housekeeping. I want to make sure everyone gets that second secret code word. It is cactus, CACTUS, cactus. It's the plant, it's got sharp spines. You find it in the desert. There's water inside, but it's hard to get to the water. This is all I know about cactuses. I think I must have learned it from a movie. I don't know if I've actually seen a cactus outside of tiny plants. Cactus. Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of ABA Inside Track. We hope you enjoyed the discussion tonight with Dr. Morris. If you did, or if you have feedback, we would love to hear from you. There are a lot of ways that you can do that. Certainly, you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can subscribe to the show if you'd like to listen to more. A couple other ways, certainly social media is one. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram as ABA Inside Track. You can find all of these episodes posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature enabled. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to the articles that are discussed in every episode, as well as a list of all of our previous episodes and links to purchase CEs for almost all of our episodes as well. And if you'd like a little bit more ABA Inside Track, why not go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track and subscribe, where for just $5 a month, you are able to get episodes a week free, as well as access to monthly social meetups, discounts at the CE store, and, all sorts of fun more. At least we're always trying to add fun more. And if you want even more of our content, you can move up to the premium $10 level to get access to our extra long book club podcast, where we talk about a specific book for 2 hours plus sometimes. And actually, as of this recording, you should pretty soon getting a preview of our latest book club, which is The Other Side of the Leash by Patricia McDonnell. It's a dog book, which is a huge departure for many of our topics. I think we only had one episode ever on puppies, or on dogs, I should say. And it's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. We want to also make sure to thank Jackie, to thank Diana, to thank Dr. Jim Carr for his intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for his interstitial music, Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and Hollis Irvin from Sycamore Workshop for his visual design. We'll be back next week with another episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!